So the market's been pretty dynamic the last couple of years for sure. I think COVID drove some excitement about certain markets and other markets took a back seat. What are you thinking about when you talk to the market and the people in the market that you work with, especially on the talent side? What are you bullish on in regards to the emerging verticals and what's maybe taking a pause?
Yeah, I think the top three would probably be software as a medical device. A lot of, especially in structural heart, there seems to be a lot of exciting things going on there. Care coordination, specifically chronic care management, I think that's going to be an incredible area. And then anything that's going to move care from the acute care setting into the home. I think that is going to be, that's probably the #1 market that I think moving forward, especially taking it out of that acute care setting, specifically in the hospital, and taking that to the home. I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are.
I probably would align with those and just getting just a little more granular on that. There's definitely a shift from the hospital to alternative sites of care, and those alternative sites of care, ASCs, right, ambulatory surgical centers, and then hospital at home. And they're really interesting because if you think about the cost of healthcare, which is 20% of our GDP, but then 80% of that 20% are the chronic disease management.
Yep.
Right? So if we're going to get down the cost of healthcare, we've got to move to alternative sites of care. Not everything has to happen in a hospital, which is where we've really driven it over the years. Right. So that's #1. And what does that do? That sets up the software, as you said, right? How do I increase an optimization of care? And how do I take it from absolutely that big brick building in the middle of the city, right, to maybe focus factory specialization? So that's one. And then the ongoing monitoring. I really have my sights on 2 areas of monitoring: wearables and then remote patient monitoring. And I keep them separate because remote patient monitoring is the monitoring of chronic disease. And you can move that to the home. Right? 100%. So when you talk about that remote patient monitoring, the RPM business, the other side is the wearables. And I do believe that we're going to have a category of the population that will be managing health instead of managing sickness. And so, you know, the compounded annual growth in both of those areas is on, I think the number on RPM is projected to be about 16% per year over the next decade. And I think it's 26% on wearables. So I think getting that data is going to be really important in our business. And I also think that digital as a whole is going to have accelerants, and I would put both of those in digital, but I would put certain aspects of digital sort of taking a breather. The telehealth push, yep, I think that's seen its time and is going to appear in an entirely different way, just, you know, on par.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think about it, timing is everything in our business, right? Like, would all of this have been possible without the onset of 5G? And I think that we hit a perfect window when COVID happened, and now remote patient monitoring, telehealth, all of these things, if COVID would have happened 5-10 years prior, these businesses probably wouldn't have taken off, and these verticals would not have seen the success that they're having now and probably will for the foreseeable future. So I would agree with you. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on maybe some markets that you think are going to be pulling back or might not have as bright of a future or as good of a run as they've had in the recent past.
Yeah. You know, the 5G thing's interesting because I'm a little concerned with that. It's going to compound the underrepresented populace that currently isn't being served in our healthcare community. So you'll have 5G in the obvious places, the major cities. But what about the areas that have tier 2, tier 3 hospitals, or even not a hospital, let alone a 5G infrastructure within 20, 30, 40 miles? So that's an area that deserves to be explored and even massively subsidized by the government. So I don't want to let that go out of the way there. I do believe the pandemic was a catalyst. Certainly reimbursement enabled telehealth on that, right? So that was a must-have, and it still continues to carry over. But it seems telehealth now is sort of taking a breather, as I mentioned. You bring up an interesting point, though, on the RPM. I think that device is going to fumble away an opportunity here. I think they're going to have a play in it, right? Because what does device have today? They have access to the patient. But their mentality on the access to the patient is usually episodic. You're sick, get into the hospital.
Right.
They don't necessarily know how to manage the lifetime of a patient like pharma does. And so if we think about chronic care is generally managed through pharmaceuticals. And pharmaceuticals work really well. However, oftentimes those patients require a titration of their meds, an adjustment of those meds based on lifestyle, diet, et cetera. So this is where RPM and wearables converge into that. And I think that the pharma companies who know how to manage the lifetime of a customer, not a patient, are going to grab that mantle and hold on to it. Device is going to continue to have a small part of it. But I do believe that you're going to start to have entities emerge where the pharma companies know how to manage that, because they'll sell more pharmaceuticals through that enablement.
Right.
And
It's a
device,
gateway.
that's right, it's a gateway. And device will still have the touch of the patient with the cost of sensors coming down, the fidelity of the signal going up, et cetera. So I see that happening a lot more. And the telehealth will still be there, but I don't think in the feature-rich environment that it was marketed in the 2 or 3 years before COVID, through COVID.
Right.
You know, I'm still a patient, heart failure, and I have my telehealth visit. I have a telehealth visit later today with my doc who manages my health, right? So I have a concierge service. They manage my health through telehealth. So that's all an expansion of sort of the continuum of care, but I see it going towards managing of health on telehealth more than the episodic event of care.
It's interesting. I've thought about this a lot, and I kind of wonder, the big strategics, are they ultimately going to become data companies, and the devices that they sell will just be the access to that data? Could we get to a point where maybe they sell the devices on a subscription model every month for a very small amount of money, just to have access to the data that those devices will be able? Because I think 75% of med tech startups now have a digital component to them.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really good point. So Medtronic just struck a massive deal. So the largest data set in cardiac comes out of Medtronic. They have been gathering data, tens of millions of data sets over the lifetime of their pacing system. So they've got all this data, but they don't necessarily have a data scientist mindset because they're a medical device company.
Right.
And so this is where I think you're going to start to see partnerships emerge, where there will be AI companies, which brings us into the AI world, AI companies that will be able to mine these enormous data sets that when human eyes look at these, it's hard to find patterns. But when you put machine eyes on these
Right.
AI, you start to see patterns emerge, new solutions to disease states. But Mike, I think when you think about lifetime patients, cardiac patients are lifetime patients.
Right.
Because even if you go and get a stent put in, what do you get put on? You get put on a blood thinner, a pharmaceutical.
Plavix, whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now, how do I monitor that? What do I go back once a year and I happen to catch it, but I catch it too late, or I get a widowmaker in the process? But what if I have the ability to monitor that on a daily basis and I kill the monster when it's tiny? So the large data sets the med tech companies will have, I do think that there'll be entities emerging in healthcare, the convergence of med tech and pharma.
Yep.
That will be the AI to unpacking that once you put machine eyes on it beyond the human eyes.
That'll ultimately move that treatment sooner in the patient's pathway versus having to identify that much later,
Where it's more expensive.
where it's more expensive.
And it's more catastrophic.
Right.
Now, let's hop on that AI just for a second. I don't think AI beyond diagnostics in the next few years is going to be a game changer. I think, oncology, yes. You mentioned cardiology before, absolutely. Again, machine eyes versus human eyes. But I think where AI makes its entry into med tech is going to be taking the burnout burden from the physician, who probably spends more than 40% of their time on documentation of a patient visit. And so I think natural language processing, I think being able to record the patient engagement process in the clinician's,
Real
spot
time.
of care,
Yep.
and then translate that, and then be able to highlight keywords, key phrases, and then the patient will take that data home, and it will be transcribed into a 4th grade level where the patient can understand it.
Right.
And certain terms will be flagged. The drug or drug therapy will be tagged, and that will allow that patient, the clinician, to give more time to the patient, i.e. the customer,
Right.
in that time. So I think AI is interesting initially on the diagnostic side with imaging, but I really think it's going to make headway on reducing that burnout on the clinician on the documentation side, which is really what's adding most of the cost to healthcare. We haven't added that many docs. In fact, we've lost more docs, but we've certainly added massive administration, which is driving up the costs.
Right. Yeah. It's the documentation, and then also the legwork and the homework that goes into collecting all of the patient's data that might be happening at a different site or might be happening through a different provider, and trying to get all that information together so that you can make a holistic pathway for this patient. That's just grossly inefficient.
Yeah, I think the number is less than 3% of patient data is digitized.
Yeah.
So you've got a great opportunity moving forward with that, where you have that convergence of biopharma, pharma, med tech, and then the management of health. That's where AI in a decade or two from now, I think the clinician will be more of sitting at a console that takes in all the data, and then we'll get a prescription on the path forward, much like Waze gives you a prescription today on your way home,
Right.
using AI and real-time data from what's happening. And you'll say, here is the continuum of health, pharma, biopharma, device, and here's the combination given the patient's sort of genetic disposition, what they're predisposed for, where they are right now, what's their lifestyle from their wearables, the convergence of all that data, Star Trek, that's where ideally.
And
I
what's
think
the
it goes.
likelihood that that will turn into X, Y, or Z?
That's right.
And so you can be proactive versus reactive, which is what our healthcare system
By the
is today.
accumulation of that real-world evidence over time, which is what Jeff Shuren and MDIC and all those are working on, is collecting that real-world evidence and outcomes based upon the therapies and then the massive data sets the strategics have. So that's where I see it going.
It'd be interesting too. We haven't seen a lot of the super apps here in the United States, but they're very common abroad, PAC Asia, even in Europe. It'd be interesting to see if anybody comes out with a super app that can really aggregate all that, where the patient logs in on one app and it's kind of like a health locker, so to speak. And the patient can go in and select, I want to give access to this document, this document. If a patient's going in and going to have a knee replacement, that doctor probably doesn't need to know their GYN history, but they can self-select. I'll give access to this, and this. It'd be interesting to see if that could come into play as well.
Well, I think that goes aligned with socialized medicine, right? So in a socialized medicine environment versus in the US, we don't have that. I think there's barriers to entry, and I also think that there's market forces that don't want that to happen in the US, because I think, United Healthcare is the 5th largest company in the world at 300 billion plus, if I'm not mistaken on the number. And the incentives are entirely misaligned across the healthcare system. So what that would do would compromise the profits in certain organizations. We'll see what happens.
An interesting take.
Mike, you and I, most of our practice revolves around emerging tech startups. And certainly the last couple of years have been, let's call it dynamic in nature on the funding front.
It's an understatement.
So your observations on the funding climate and any thoughts about where you see it might be going over the next couple of years?
Yeah, dynamic's a good word for it. I think we've seen, a lot of different stages over the last 18 months. Companies that don't have a really clear economic and clinical value proposition are really finding it challenging, and maybe rightfully so. But what I do think is interesting is those companies that do have a very clear plan and a very clear value proposition to the market. I think they've been the benefactors of that, because those are the companies that are getting invested, and those companies are seeing large rounds or larger rounds. But I do think maybe as we move into the second half of this year, we'll probably, I think we will see an improvement in the market potentially. We've seen the strategics. There's been a lot of divestitures, and that growth has to be replaced somewhere. And usually it comes through acquisition at that point, and that will probably return a fair amount of cash, of treasuries back to the funds, which I think we could see that reinvested in the market at some point.
Yeah. It's tough because if you compare it to 21, right? 21 was a banner year. I've been at this 32 years and you have 20 plus years. So I don't know if we'll ever see a year like 21. So everything seems to be compared to that. 22 was still a darn good year comparatively when you take every year in the previous decade.
Right.
And Q1 of 2023 was not bad. I think healthcare investment from the venture community was almost 6.8 billion. And when you put that on an annualized basis, it's not bad.
Right.
But
or a historical basis.
On a historical basis,
yeah.
It wasn't bad at all. But what's happened, I think, is that you think about a classic PMA. That's 7 to 10 years.
Right.
That's a long investment, right? And on these 10-year funds, these venture funds, it's really hard to invest in that. And it's a massive investment. You're talking 200 million plus for a PMA at a minimum. That's hard to do these days, especially if you're looking for a B, C, or even a round beyond that, because it's hard to get a lead. Most of the big players are holding their dry powder for their existing investors. Therefore, you can't get a whale on a lead. Therefore, you can't get additional investors in that. Right. So that's put a hitch in the get along. But I will tell you where I see it going rapidly. 2 areas. The build to buy model. So when you take a classic startup, you have this great idea, you build a product, you go through clinical, navigate the FDA, put together a sales team, prove adoption, ongoing utilization, rinse and repeat, and hopefully a strategic shows up with a checkbook.
Right.
Or an acquirer, I should say. But you're playing in the dark. The build to buy, though, is you've got these organizations. Revival is one of them down in Texas. Another one is Orchestra Biomed up in Jersey. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they have established partnerships with these strategics and said, tell me a problem that you're having inside. Where's there a gap in your portfolio? What is it that you don't have the core competency in-house or the horsepower? Or what would you like to off-balance sheet the investment as to handle differently so on a shareholder perspective basis, it doesn't necessarily eat into your quarterly numbers.
Right.
And they're partnering with those companies and they're building out product platforms that already have a built-in buyer at the end. And they're sharing clinical power, product development power, and then commercialization power because you don't have to get as large of an investment in order to get that property transacted. Because if you're looking to 4 to 6x from your investors, and you've got to put another 100 million in investment because you want to go commercial, that's another 500 million to close to $1 billion potentially on the transaction on the back end. And so that build to buy model is one alternative that's coming up. The other alternative is, you and I talked about this at dinner the other night, private equity. So PE historically has said, I want to buy revenue. And in their roll-ups, they've primarily been playing in the contract manufacturing world. But groups like KKR, Carlyle, GTCR are now going into the turf of the VC firms who no longer want to buy 5, 10K products because it's not a big enough hit for them.
Right.
They left themselves in a really precarious situation. But PE, you look what Duke Rollins did with Cordis, they're buying a revenue play. And then what they're doing now is investing in pre-market pre-commercial, even pre-FDA investments, that while Cordis is selling into these call points, we're bringing in very low risk 510K products to continue to feed into that sales force's bag. And PE in certain areas is going to move back down into product development, even play with the FDA on 510 low clinical risk
Short
on
regulatory
large
path.
markets. And I think that VC is going to find itself in a very difficult situation where they're trying to invest in too big of a play, but they're going to get competition from the build to buy model. And then you're going to get the 510K products that maybe, you know, there's a great guy out there, Schoen Foytek, has built an unbelievable career in a certain little category and has hit 50 to 70 to $100 million build, sell, move on.
Yep.
Build, sell, move on. Private equity is going to move into that area.
And it's unique because they've got the capabilities of doing that because they're operators.
They're operators, exactly right. They understand how to handle supply chain. They understand on a daily basis. These are really smart, high-level MBAs who
Data-driven.
Data-driven, not as emotional as VCs are. VCs go, what's up for sale? Where's the market going?
Right.
And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but if
that's
you're
their
a
business.
VC, that's their business. But the PE teams, they're operators, they're supply chain. They rub the pennies out of the nickels, and they don't hamstring you. They're actually very generous if you can make an evidence-based argument on things. And they're watching that business on a weekly basis if you work with PE, which keeps it healthier.
Right.
Right? And
Those businesses are held accountable, whereas a VC might come in, take a board seat, they get a quarterly update, and might have very limited involvement in the day-to-day business moving forward.
that's a good point. And when you and I started, I might have started a couple years before you, board members back then were previous operators.
Right.
Board members back then had 5 startups under their belt. When there was a reg issue, that board member was in the details. When there was a supply chain issue or a design issue, those board members knew they could sit at the table, the good ones,
Right.
and affect change. Now there are more VCs that have never turned the wrench than ever before.
Yep.
And you're seeing it in the silly investments. You're seeing it in not being able to identify the issue until it's way too late. And you're seeing it in their inability to really hone in on what partnership should we have, where do I think you're going to hit a sort of a ditch in the road. And a lot of these CEOs now in these startups are first-time CEOs.
That's right.
And so they don't have any experience. They're not getting coaches hired. The board isn't coaching that CEO and giving that CEO enough latitude to grow. So it's going to be a really interesting time. I'm very bullish on the financing world, but I do think over the next 24, 36 months, you're going to see a shift. And I think you're also, just to finish up, I think you're going to see the large strategics who've just taken it on the chin in their entree, as an example, to the surgical robotics world. Love Medtronic, love J&J. They're really good at what they do,
Yep.
but they are not a surgical robotic company. I think you're going to start to see partnerships emerge, whether it's a public company like an Ascensus or a Distal Motion or EndoQuest. And I think you're going to see partnerships emerge where it's not a full acquisition. And you're going to have licensing deals and rev share deals.
Right.
Because you can't buy some of these technical companies that are all digital if you're not a digital native, because the ongoing product development is really the key after you acquire that technology. And if you don't have that core competency in-house, you're going to buy an asset that quickly is going to expire in value.
Yeah, and to that end, it probably makes sense because the technology is leapfrogging so quickly that the dollars just don't make sense to make full acquisitions. It's easier to just do a rev share and until it, do a rev share that makes sense until it doesn't.
Well, then what you do too, Mike, is you get to hold on to the talent, which is yours and mine world, right? So what's the first thing that happens when one of our startups gets sold? They scatter.
People start looking.
They immediately, and it's not even they take their check, because not a lot of people really get rich on startups. So you and I know that, right? A few do, and I'm not even talking generational wealth. I'm talking about if you've got a couple $100,000 out of the startup, you're lucky.
It's a win. Yeah.
It's a win. But what happens is the brain trust leaves. So when the acquirer picks up that highly technical, new technology cycle company that is not tribally known by the strategic, all the intellectual firepower leaves. But if you make an arrangement in a licensing deal or a rev share deal, and you tie incentives to those engineers to not leave and say, listen, we're going to give you even more dry powder to develop other products in that pathway.
Build what's next.
Hang out.
Yeah.
So you get the best of startup and you get the best of funding. And now what you do is you establish a lifeline of the intellectual horsepower, the dry powder on investment, and then the distribution network. And so I think that is a pathway that the strategics who do that, and my guess is I think it's going to be Stryker who does it more often than most first. I think Kevin's got a really good equation there. I think eventually you'll have them fall in place there as soon as they can get out of their own way. And you've seen hints of it. Biosense Webster is an example with J&J. They're doing a really good job with that. The recent acquisition of Abiomed, they're giving the funding, the distribution network, and they're leaving the engineers alone. And so you don't want to lose those Abiomed engineers because those people who develop that Impella device have such a tribal knowledge that you don't want them scattering.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on that, not only does it give that startup an ability to keep its startup nature, but gives that mind share, that brain trust that stays there, gives them a more likely path to success.
Yes.
Versus going at it alone or with the dry powder that you talk about from the strategics and whatnot. So I 100% agree.
Well, you and I are two OGs in the search business. Not many have sort of been around performing at the levels that you certainly have, and our firm has. And you and I discuss this often. Where do you see executive search potentially going over the next few years?
Oh man, it's the business has changed so much. I mean, we were talking about this the other night at dinner, right? Like, you saw the business when you were opening up mail and getting resumes in the mail, and then it went to the facsimile, and then email, and then e-recruiting. We had job boards, and then we got ATSs and LinkedIn, and at every stage. I know you'll chuckle when I say this, but how many times have you heard this is going to put you out of business, right? And fortunately, I think there's just warm body decisions that are made in our business that technology just can't replace, and I do believe that. But in terms of where it's going next, I think we're in a really precarious place because when we started in this business, it was all about your network. It was all about your database. We've laughed about this in the past. You could take the database and throw it out the window. Everybody's got the same database now. It's LinkedIn. The companies have the candidates, and so it's then how does a search firm create value for that client? And I believe that, and I know that we've talked about this, a lot in the past. It's being able to run a really tight process, being able to help with building a recruiting brand in the market, and then telling that, sharing that brand in mass via social media, which you guys here at the Mullings Group, you bent the curve as it relates to that. So I think that's, those are a couple of things that I think are going to be very important moving forward. I'd love to get your thoughts.
You took me down memory lane. I remember when I was in Woodbury, New York, and I first started my career in 1989 with Bill Joes. And when you got a resume in, the interview happened oftentimes at the same time you mailed the resume to the client in time for the interview. Because if you left that candidate out there too long, they were probably scooped up by somebody else. So we were mailing resumes, to your point.
Yeah.
And then the fax machine came, and Jerry LaRoe, who worked a pharmaceutical desk, those resumes were 22 pages long because of the publication. So when you came in the morning, the white piece of paper with the red around it was already on the floor, and Jerry only got 2 resumes, but they took up the whole roll. So for a moment there, you took me down memory lane. And the database is true, Mike. Everybody has access to the same people. Now, here's the key. I think there's a divergence in talent access, and we can call it search. It's a subset of that. There's a divergence happening where a large part of the market is not going to change their ways. And those are generally, one desk, two desk offices on the search side that have their business. It's a little bit of a lifestyle for them. There's nothing wrong with that. There are doctors who practice like that.
Yep.
There are accountants who practice like that. But if you're really going to add tremendous value to the market, and to your point, some of us are bending the curve and creating the market, it's going to be the partnering with, it's going to start with the emerging tech firms. That they're going to say, okay, this search firm has a specialty in our category, meaning they know the domain as well as anybody, which is your firm, which is my firm. We know most of the verticals, disease states. We certainly know all the movers and shakers.
The players, yeah.
Right? Yeah. But what can we bring beside those relationships to the market? Well, what we can do is we can explain to our clients, this is what the market right now is wanting, hearing, and seeing. And by the way, nobody else is doing this, and we want to get your hiring brand out there. Why? And why is that important? Because right now, in the old days when you and I started, it was manufacturing and footprint was the big lever point.
Yep.
But the technology cycles have accelerated from 20 years now to 3 years, 5 years in that area. And if you don't bring in the force multipliers or the Price is Law people, as we refer to, you're going to get lapped really quickly. Now, those Price is Law people and those force multipliers don't look at want ads.
Right.
They don't apply. How many times, when I call a force multiplier, you call them, and you say, hey, have you got a resume? What do they say?
Nope. I haven't put one together in 10, 15 years.
Why?
I've always been tapped from prior leaders that I've worked with, that I've had success with, and never really had to look for a job.
That's right. And have you ever sent in, whenever I do my public speaking and I talk to the CEOs, I said, how many of you, put up your hands, have ever blindly sent a resume into a job posting? And rarely does a hand go up.
Right.
And so you're trying to attract the best people, and they don't have resumes because they're not actively looking. And when
they're heads down,
working, solving the hard problem.
well compensated,
Well compensated.
no reason to look.
No. But with LinkedIn, the platform, here's the things to think about. The search firms that come out and partner with organizations and start telling the story about a hiring brand. Here's our team. Here's what we do. Here's why we do it. Here's who you may become. The force multipliers, the Price is Law people will watch that. When they do look up, they'll find it.
From afar.
From afar. And it'll be a while because they're not necessarily looking. But if you build that story, you build that hiring brand out loud online, and then you partner with a great search firm, or even if you bring that in-house, and then you start recruiting a year ahead before you need that person, or even 6 months ahead before you need that person, and build that bench. I want to know the top 10 manufacturing leaders. I want to know the top 10 quality leaders. I want you to get in front of them, Mike, Joe. I want them to be aware of what we're doing so they start watching what we're doing. So when I need them in Q1 of 2024, and you call them, or you reach out to them on LinkedIn or whatever the platform is, they're going to say, huh, I've been watching. Can you answer these questions for me?
Right.
I've been watching.
Right.
Right? It's a totally different relationship.
Buying decisions in general, whether it's buying a car or a house or whatever, buying decisions are made both, I believe, consciously and subconsciously way before anybody ever talks to a sales rep. If you were going to buy a car today, you wouldn't just drive up onto the lot, test drive it, have them explain the features and benefits of the car. No, you're going to get online, you're reading reports, you're narrowing down your options, and then maybe when you get it down to 1 or 2 or 3 cars you're really interested in, then maybe you'll go talk to a rep and try to really hone in on what it is you're going to buy. And I do believe those decisions and that research is done consciously and subconsciously. And I think it directly applies to search as well.
Look, you just made a great point, right? I was forever a Beamer guy.
Yep.
And then about 6 years ago, I started seeing the advertising that Mercedes-Benz started doing. And I started looking at the Mercedes-Benz. And when the buying came, I didn't even need to be sold, because in my mind, I had already emotionally bought due to the unbelievable branding. And that works across the board, whether you're a luxury goods person. Why do you think Louis Vuitton is so amazing? Why do you think Rolex is so amazing? Does anybody unpack the Rolex watch to really? No.
They don't know the features and benefits of why
but
it's
they've
better
been
than.
spoken to on who you will become when you have that watch on. They've been marketed
what that signifies.
That's right, what that represents. And who else is in that elite group? That same thing works on brand as it does on hiring who's in the foxhole with you. And the only way you find out who's in the foxhole in that company and what they're doing is if the company lives it out loud in front of the populace that is potentially downrange making that buying decision. So that is where search, i.e., and I don't mean search in yours and my business, in the headhunting business, I mean search in talent access in an organization.
100% agree.
Yeah, and then one last thing. As soon as the organizations start to realize they need to bifurcate HR from talent access, because they're two entirely different animals, two entirely different practices, that's when you'll be able to get those force multipliers. And again, because of the technological acceleration of these product development cycles, is you don't just fall behind a little bit. It's a little bit. I was a racer on bicycles. If you lose that wheel of the rear wheel, and you're in the peloton, Tour de France is on right now, so go watch it. If you lose that wheel by about 6 or 8 inches, you just get dropped.
Right.
As a cyclist, if you're not able to stay up with the technology as you draft. Yeah. The same thing happens in technology today. The second that you don't have the talent to stay on the back wheel of the industry leader and eventually draft and move beyond them, you are going to get dropped. And that dropping occurs directly from the talent you have in the organization.
Yeah, and you know, we've talked about this before. HR is a full-time job. You know, there are benefits, there's employee, you know, conflict resolution. Those leaders don't have the time or energy to put into what we agree would be the most important function within an organization. And I think most leaders would agree with that. So it's interesting that they don't have like a chief talent officer. Mm-hmm. They've got a chief people officer, but we don't have a chief talent officer. And I wonder if that will be something that we'll see emerge moving forward.
You're exactly right. People are our number one resource, right? Well, cool. You're taking care of your people in-house, but what about your future customer?
Right.
And that in itself, you just called it out, there needs to be a shepherd, a Sherpa that drives that, and that's a function that reports up to the CEO, not through the head people officer.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Mike, I know people have been watching the closeness of our firms over the last couple of years. The individuals in the market have watched us, and as well as the startups. They see a lot of the collaboration we're doing together. And you know, I think it's good that we have a dialogue around that, because people are scratching their heads like, you and Mike, or I see you at LSI talking to each other, so aren't you guys competitors?
Sure. Yeah.
So how would we answer that?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I don't see our business any different than I do our customers and clients' business, and I've long contended that I think strategic partnerships are going to be the most important aspect of medtech and digital health companies moving forward. You might have the best widget on the planet, but everything is so interconnected now, and you've got hardware, you've got firmware, you've got software, you've got all of these things, and startups can't build everything. You have to have strategic partners in the marketplace, and it's really tough to pass the value proposition that you're intending to the customer if you haven't chosen the right strategic partners. And I think it doesn't. I think it's the exact same thing applies in executive search. I know, personally speaking, that we've had a number of collaborations over the last 5 years, and the value proposition that we've been able to extend to the market and to those clients has been significantly greater than if we would have gone at it alone. And I think the clients want it. I think, and so I've really valued the relationship that we've had with you guys, and I think the work that I'm doing is better for it, and I think that the customers are getting a better product in the end.
You and I have talked about each of our firm's practices that we built up, right? So each of the practices always have things that we could, one, learn off each other processes.
Yep.
The second is the pie is so darn big that the pie actually expands in our partnership, because there are areas of expertise that you bring in that we might not either have chosen to penetrate or still in device. And there are these relationships that you have, and there's relationships that our firm has. To your point, that we bring in collaboratively, and the clients, the smart clients go, oh, more in Mullings? I get the best of both of you? Yeah, sure, it's no skin off my back. In fact, the value to my firm has just become larger on working together.
Yep.
So,
1 + 1 is 3, or 1 + 1 is 4.
Yeah, at least. So when you have a search, your searches go substantially faster when we work together.
Yep.
We trade information in the market. And my team is learning from you, because what you've done over your 2+ decades in the business, continue to teach my team. And there's no secrets in this business. No. But the pie, your firm's top line grows from our relationship. Our top line and our firm grows because of the relationship. So, I think the people most of the time are the ones who feel threatened that you and I are collaborating so much.
Probably.
Because it becomes even an unsurmountable sort of body of work between the two of us. They look at and they're just like, damn it.
It's a formidable force.
That's right. So we'll continue pushing on this and putting the gas pedal down. And I think what you're doing and what we're doing is setting the tone for the market that others just have a hard time matching.
Right.
And you're incredibly selective on who you work with. We're incredibly selective, meaning search partners as well as clients.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I do think that it's a mind shift, but your biggest competitor could very well be your best partner. And in this case, I think we've proven that to be true.
Absolutely have.